Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of Napoleon's Marshals by R.P. Dunn-Pattison. Chapter 2, Joachim Murat, Marshal, King of Naples.
Stable boy, seminarist, marshal, king, Murat holds the unchallenged position of Prince of Gascons. Petulant, persevering, ambitious, and vain, he surpasses D'Artagnan himself in his overwhelming conceit. The third son of an innkeeper of La Bastide Fortunière in Upper Quercy, Joachim Murat was born on March 25, 1767. From his earliest childhood, Joachim was a horse lover and a frequenter of the stables, but his parents had higher aims for their bright, smiling, intelligent darling, and destined him for the priesthood. The young seminarist was highly thought of by the preceptors at the College of Saint Michel at Cahors and the Lazarist Fathers at Toulouse. But neither priest nor mother had truly grasped his dashing character, and one February morning in 1787, Joachim slipped quietly out of the seminary doors and enlisted in the chasseurs of the Ardennes, who were at the moment billeted in Toulouse. 2 years later, this promising recruit, having fallen foul of the military authorities, had to leave the service under a cloud. A post as draper's assistant was a poor exchange for the young soldier, who found the cavalry service of the Royal Army scarcely dashing enough, but the revolution gave an outlet which Murat was quick to seize. For 3 years, the future king harangued village audiences of Quercy on the iniquities of caste and the equality of all men. So that when, in February 1792, the Assembly called for volunteers for the Garde Constitutionnelle of Louis XVI, what better choice could the National Guard of Montfaucon make than in nominating Joachim Murat, the handsome ex-sergeant of the Chasseurs of the Ardennes? In Paris, Joachim soon found that the royal road to success lay in denouncing loudly all superior officers of lack of patriotism. Soon there was no more brazen-voiced accuser than Murat. In the course of a year, he worked his way out of the Garde Constitutionnelle, and by April 1793, he had attained the rank of captain in the 12th Chasseurs. Meanwhile, he had been selected as aide-de-camp by General DIEU de Molans. Having seen no service, he owed his appointment largely to his conceit and good looks. Blue-eyed, with an aquiline nose and smiling lips, with long chestnut curls falling over his well-poised head, endowed with great physical strength, shown in his strong, supple arms and in the long, flat-thighed legs of a horseman, he appeared the most perfect type of the daredevil, dashing cavalry soldier. The moderate Republican general, DIEU de Molans, was useful to him for a time, but the young Gascon saw that the days of the extremist were close at hand. Accordingly, he allied himself with an adventurer called Landrieu, who was raising a body of cutthroats whose object was plunder, not fighting. The convention, which had licensed Landrieu to raise this corps of patriotic defenders of the country, accepted his nomination of Murat as acting lieutenant colonel. But they soon fell out, for Murat had the audacity to try and make these patriots fight instead of merely seeking plunder. The consequence of this quarrel was that, early in 1794, he found himself accused as a ci-devant noble. Imprisoned at Amiens and brought before the Committee of Public Safety, in a fit of Republican enthusiasm, he changed his name to Murat. But this did not save him, and he owed his life to a deputation from his native Quercy, which proved both his humble birth and his high republicanism. The 13th Vendémiaire was the turning point in Murat's life, for on that day, for the first time, he came in contact with his future chief, the young General Bonaparte, and gained his attention by the masterly way he saved the guns at Sablons from the hands of the royalists. The future emperor ever knew when to reward merit, and on being appointed to command the army in Italy, he at once selected him as his aide-de-camp. So far, he had seen little or no war service, but the campaign of 1796 proved that Bonaparte's judgment was sound, for by the end of the year, there was no longer any necessity for Murat to blow his own trumpet. In the short campaign against the Sardinians, he showed his talent as a cavalry leader by his judgment in charges at Dago and Mondovi. He had no cause to grumble that he was not appreciated, for his general selected him to take to Paris the news of this victorious campaign and of the triumphant negotiations of Carrasco. He returned from Paris in May as brigadier general, in time to take part in the crossing of the Mincio and to rob Kilmaine of some of his honors. The commander-in-chief still kept him attached to the headquarters staff and constantly employed him on special service. His enterprises were numerous and varied. 1 week at Genoa on a special diplomatic mission, a week or two later leading a forlorn attack on the great fortress of Mantua, then commanding the right wing of the army covering the siege, he showed himself ever resourceful and daring. But during the autumn of 1796, he fell under the heavy displeasure of his chief. For at Milan and Montebello, Josephine had shown too great favor to the young cavalry general. Murat accordingly had no scruples in intriguing with Barras against his chief. But his glorious conduct at Rivoli once again brought him back to favor, and Bonaparte entrusted him with an infantry brigade in the advance on Vienna, and later with a delicate independent mission in the Valtelline. But Murat, unlike Lannes, Marmont, and Duroc, was not yet indispensable to Bonaparte, and accordingly was left with the army of Italy when the general returned in triumph to Paris. It was mainly owing to MASSÉNA's enthusiastic report of his service in the Roman campaign at the close of 1797 that he was selected as one of the supernumerary officers in the Egyptian expedition. So far, Murat had not yet been able to distinguish himself above his comrades in arms. MASSÉNA, Augereau, Serrurier, and La Harpe left him far in the rear, but Egypt was to give him the chance of proving his worth, and showing that he was not only a dashing officer, but a cavalry commander of the first rank. He led the cavalry of the advance guard in the march up the Nile, and was present at the Battle of the Pyramids and the taking of Cairo. But so far the campaign, instead of bringing him fresh honors, nearly brought him disgrace, for he joined the party of grumblers, and was one of those who were addressed in the famous reprimand, "I know some generals are mutinous and preach revolt. Let them take care. I am as high above a general as above a drummer, and if necessary, I will as soon have the one shot as the other." On July 27, 1798, Murat was appointed governor of the province of Kaliub, which lies north of Cairo. To keep order among his turbulent subjects, his whole force consisted of a battalion of infantry, 25 cavalrymen, and a 3-pounder gun. His governorship was only part of the work Bonaparte required of him, for he was constantly away organizing and leading light columns by land or river, harrying the Arabs and disbanded Mamelukes, sweeping the country, collecting vast depots of corn and cattle, remounting the cavalry, proving himself a past master in irregular warfare. So well did he do his work that the commander-in-chief selected him to command the whole of the cavalry in the Syrian expeditionary force. Thanks to his handling of his horsemen, the march through Palestine occasioned the French but little loss. During the siege of Acre, he commanded the covering force and pushed reconnaissances far and wide. So feared was his name that the whole Turkish army fled before him on the banks of the Jordan, and left their camp and immense booty in the hands of the French. But though he had thus destroyed the relieving force, Acre, victualled by the English fleet, still held out, and Bonaparte had to retreat to Egypt. It was at Aboukir that Murat consolidated his reputation as a great commander. The Turkish general had neglected to rest the right flank of his first line on the sea, and Murat, seizing his opportunity, fell on the unguarded flank with the full weight of his cavalry and rolled the unfortunate Turks into the water. Thereafter, by the aid of a battery of artillery, the center of the second line of the Turkish army was broken, and the French horse dashing into the gap once again made short work of the enemy, and their leader captured with his own hands the Turkish commander. Bonaparte, in his dispatch, did full justice to his subordinate. The victory is mainly due to General Murat. I ask you to make him general of division. His brigade of cavalry has achieved the impossible. Murat himself was much distressed at being wounded in the face, as he feared it might destroy his good looks. However, he soon had the satisfaction of writing to his father, "The doctors tell me I shall not be in the least disfigured, so tell all the young ladies that even if Murat has lost some of his good looks, they won't find that he has lost any of his bravery in the war of love." His grumbles forgiven, Murat left Egypt among the chosen band of followers of whose fidelity Napoleon was assured. His special mission was to gain over the cavalry to the side of his chief. He it was who, with Leclerc on the 18th Brumaire, forced his way into the orangery at the head of the grenadiers and hurled out the deputies. The first consul rewarded him amply, appointing him inspector of the consular guard, and later still, in preference to his rival, Lannes, gave him in marriage his sister Caroline. Murat had met Caroline Bonaparte at Montebello during the Italian campaign of 1796, and had at once been struck by her beauty. Like many another cavalier, he had a flame in every country, or rather, in every town which he visited. But by 1799, the gay Gascon saw that it was time to finish sowing his wild oats, since destiny was offering him a chance which falls to the lot of few mortals. It was by now clear that the first consul's star was in the ascendant. Already his family were reaping the fruits of his success. Ambition, pride, and love were the cords of the net which drew the willing Murat to Caroline. As brother-in-law to the first consul, Joachim felt secure against his bitter rival, Lannes. To add point to this success, he knew that the victor of Montebello was straining every nerve to gain this very prize. Moreover, Fortune herself favored his suit. Bonaparte had offered the hand of Caroline to the great General Moreau, but the future victor of Hohenlinden refused to join himself to the Corsican triumph. To cover his confusion, the first consul was glad to give his sister's hand to one of his most gallant officers, especially as by so doing he once and for all removed the haunting fear of an intrigue between him and Josephine. Accordingly, on January 25, 1800, Murat and Caroline were pronounced man and wife in the temple of the canton of Plailly by the president of the canton. Though Caroline only brought with her a dot of 40,000 francs, she stood for what was better still, immense possibilities. Murat's honeymoon was cut short by the Marengo campaign. In April, he started as lieutenant general in command of the cavalry to join the army of the reserve at Dijon. Once the corps of Lannes had, by the capture of Ivrea, secured the opening into Italy, the cavalry were able to take up their role, and with irresistible weight, they swept down the plains of Lombardy, forced the river crossings, and on June 2nd entered Milan. Thence the first consul dispatched his horsemen to seize Piacenza, the important bridge across the Po, the key of the Austrian lines of communication. Murat, with a few troops, crossed the river in some 20 small rowing boats, and dashing forward, captured the bridge head on the southern bank, and thus secured not only the peaceful crossing of his force, but the capture of the town and the immense Austrian depots. At Marengo, the cavalry acted in separate brigades, and the decisive stroke of the battle fell to the lot of the younger Kellerman, whose brilliant charge decided the day in favor of the French. The dispatches only mentioned that General Murat's clothes were riddled by bullets. So far, Murat had always held subordinate commands. His great ambition was to become the commander-in-chief of an independent army. His wife, Caroline, and his sister-in-law, Josephine, were constant in their endeavors to gain this distinction for him from the first consul. But it was not till the end of 1800 that they succeeded, and then only partially, for in December, the lieutenant general was appointed commander of a corps of observation, whose headquarters were at Milan, and whose duty was to overawe Tuscany and the Papal States. His campaign in central Italy is more noticeable for his endeavors to shake himself free from the control of General Brune, the commander-in-chief of the Army of Italy, than for any very brilliant maneuvers. Tuscany and the Papal States were easily conquered, and the King of Naples was only too glad to buy peace at Foligno. Italy lay at the feet of the French general, but what was most gratifying of all, after his successful negotiation with the King of Naples, the first consul tacitly accepted the title which his brother-in-law had assumed of commander-in-chief of the Army of Naples. Murat had the satisfaction of having under his orders Lieutenant General SOULT, 3 generals of division, and 4 generals of brigade. For the moment, his Gascon vanity was satiated, while his Gascon greed was appeased by substantial bribes from all the conquered countries of the peninsula. The commander-in-chief was joined at Florence in May 1801 by his wife, Caroline, and his young son, Achille, born in January, whom he found charming, already possessed of 2 teeth. In the capital of Tuscany, Murat gravely delivered to the inhabitants a historical lecture on their science, their civilization, and the splendor of their state under the Medici. He spent the summer in visiting the watering places of Italy. In August, the first consul raised him to the command of the troops of the Cisalpine Republic, and he retained this post for the next 2 years, and had his headquarters in Milan, making occasional expeditions to Paris and Rome, and on the whole content with his position, save for occasional quarrels with Melzi, the president of the Italian Republic. Their jurisdictions overlapped, and the Gascon would play second fiddle to no one save to his great brother-in-law. In January 1804, the first consul recalled Murat to Paris, nominating him commandant of the troops of the 1st Military Division and of the National Guard, and governor of the city. Bonaparte's object was not so much to please his brother-in-law as to strengthen himself. He was concentrating his own family, clan, and all his most faithful followers in readiness for the great event, the proclamation of the empire. Men like Lannes, whose views were republican, were discreetly kept out of the way on foreign missions, but Murat, as Bonaparte knew, was a pliant tool. As early as 1802, he had hotly favored the Concordat and had had his marriage recelebrated by Cardinal Consalvi. And both Caroline and Joachim infinitely preferred being members of the imperial family of the Emperor of the French to being merely relations of the successful general and first consul of the French Republic. They were willing also to obey the future emperor's commands and to aid him socially by entertaining on a lavish scale, and their residence in Paris, the Hotel Taillisson, became the center of gorgeous entertainments. While Murat strutted about in sky-blue overalls covered with gold spangles, invented new uniforms, and bought expensive aigrettes for his busby, his wife showed her rococo taste by furnishing her drawing room in red satin and gold, and her bedroom in rose-colored satin and old point lace. They had their reward. 5 days after the proclamation of the empire, after a furious scene, Napoleon conceded the title of Imperial Highness to his sister with the bitter words, "To listen to you, people would think that I had robbed you of the heritage of the late king, our father." Meanwhile, the governor of Paris had received his marshal's baton, and in the following February was created senator, prince, and grand admiral of France. The rupture of the Peace of Amiens did not affect the life of the governor of Paris. For 2 years he enjoyed this office with all its opportunities of ostentation and display. But in August 1805, the approaching war with Austria caused the emperor to summon his most brilliant cavalry leader to his side. In that month, he dispatched him, traveling incognito as Colonel Beaumont, to survey the military roads into Germany, and especially to study the converging roads round Würzburg and the suitability of that town as an advanced depot for an army operating on the Danube. From Würzburg, Murat traveled hurriedly through Nuremberg, Ratisbon, and Passau as far as the river Inn, returning via Munich, Ulm, the Black Forest, and Strasbourg. Immediately on his return, the emperor appointed him lieutenant of the empire and commandant in his absence of all the troops cantoned along the Rhine, and of such corps of the Grand Army as reached that river before himself. When war actually broke out, Murat's duty was to mask, with his cavalry in the Black Forest, the turning movement of the other corps of the Grand Army, which were striking at the Austrian rear. Once the turning movement was completed, the prince was entrusted with the command of the left wing of the army, which included his own cavalry division and the corps of Lannes and Ney. Excellent as he was as cavalry commander in the field, Murat had no head for great combinations. Instead of profiting by the advice of those able soldiers, Lannes and Ney, he spent his time quarreling with them. He accordingly kept his troops on the wrong side of the Danube, with the result that in spite of Ney's brilliant action at Elchingen, 2 divisions of the Austrians under the Archduke Ferdinand escaped from Ulm. Prince Murat, however, retrieved his error by his brilliant pursuit of the escaped Austrians, and by hard riding and fighting, captured quite half of the Archduke's command. Impetuosity, perseverance, and dash are undoubtedly useful traits in the character of a cavalry commander, and of these he had his fair share. But his jealousy and vanity often led him astray. During the advance down the Danube, in his desire to gain the credit of capturing Vienna, he lost touch completely with the Russians and Austrians who had retreated across the Danube at Krems, and he involved the emperor in a dangerous position by leaving the unbeaten Russians on the flank of his line of communications. But the prince quickly made amends for his rashness. The ruse by which he and Lannes captured the bridge below Vienna was discreditable, no doubt, from the point of view of morality. It was a direct lie to tell the Austrian commander that an armistice had been arranged and the bridge ceded to the French. But the fact remains that Murat saved the emperor and the French army from the difficult and costly operation of crossing the broad Danube in the face of the Allies. A few days later, the prince's vanity postponed for some time the culminating blow. For although he had so successfully bluffed the enemy, he could not realize that they could deceive him, and believing their tales of an armistice, he allowed the Allies to escape from Napoleon's clutches at Hollabrünn. At Austerlitz, the Prince Marshal covered himself with glory. In command of the left wing, ably backed by Lannes, he threw the whole weight of his cavalry on the Russians, demonstrating to the full the efficacy of a well-timed succession of charges on broken infantry, and giving a masterly lesson in the art of reforming disorganized horsemen by the use he made of the solid ranks of Lannes's infantry, from behind which he issued again and again in restored order to fall on the shaken ranks of the enemy. At Austerlitz, he was at his best. His old quarrel with Lannes was for the moment forgotten. His lieutenants, Nansouty, Taupoul, and Sebastiani, were too far below him to cause him any jealousy. The action on the left was mainly one of cavalry, in which quickness of eye and decision were everything, where a fault could be retrieved by charging in person at the head of the staff, or by a few fierce words to a regiment slightly demoralized. Rapidity of action and a self-confidence which, on the battlefield, never felt itself beaten, were the cause of Murat's success. It was the fixed policy of Napoleon to secure the Rhine Valley, so that never again would it be possible for the Austrians to threaten France. To gain this end, he originated the Confederation of the Rhine, grouping all the small Rhineland states in a confederation of which he himself was the protector, and binding the rulers of the individual states to his dynasty, either by marriage or by rewards. As part of this scheme, the emperor allotted to Murat and Caroline the duchies of Cleves and Berg, welding them into one province under the title of the Grand Duchy of Berg. Thus, the Gascon innkeeper's son became in 1806 Joachim, Prince and Grand Admiral of France and Grand Duke of Berg. He gained this honor not as Murat, the brilliant cavalry general, but as Prince Joachim, the brother-in-law of the Emperor Napoleon. The Grand Duke and the Grand Duchess did not, however, reside long in their capital, Dusseldorf. They infinitely preferred Paris. In their eyes, Berg was but a stepping stone to higher things, a source of profit and a pretext for exalting themselves at the expense of their neighbors. The Grand Duke entrusted the interior management of the duchy to his old friend Agar, who had served him well in Italy and who later became Count of Mosberg. Any prosperity which the Grand Duke enjoyed was entirely due to the financial ability of Agar. Murat, however, kept foreign affairs in his own hands. As foreign minister, by simply taking what he wanted, he added considerably to the extent of his duchy. But, like all Napoleon's satellites, he constantly found his position humiliating, for in spite of his tears and prayers, he had continually to see his duchy sacrificed to France. It was no use to complain that Napoleon had taken away the fortress of Wesel, which had been handed over to the Grand Duchy by special treaty by the King of Prussia, for, as Queen Hortense wisely asked him, who had really made that treaty? Who had given him the duchy, the fortress, and everything? In September 1806, Murat's second and last visit to Dusseldorf was brought to an abrupt close by the opening of the Prussian campaign. On the eve of the Battle of Jena, his cavalry covered 40 miles and arrived in time to give the enemy the coup de grace on the following day, driving them in flight into Weimar. Then followed the famous pursuit across Prussia, in which Murat captured first-class fortresses with cavalry regiments and divisions of infantry with squadrons of horse, and ended by seizing Blücher and the whole of the Prussian artillery on the shore of the Baltic at Lübeck. But though his cavalry had thus wiped the Prussian army out of existence, the war dragged on, for, as in 1805, the Russians had entered the field. In November, the emperor dispatched his brother-in-law to command the French corps which were massing round Warsaw. The Grand Duke read into this order the idea that he was destined to become the king of a revived Poland. Accordingly, he made a triumphant entry into Warsaw in a fantastic uniform, red leather boots, tunic of cloth of gold, sword belt glittering with diamonds, and a huge busby of rich fur bedecked with costly plumes. The Poles greeted him with enthusiasm, and Murat hastened to write to the emperor that the Poles desired to become a nation under a foreign king, given them by your majesty. While the Grand Duke dreamed of his Polish crown, the climate defeated the French troops, and when the emperor arrived at the front, the prince had to lay aside his royal aspirations. But in spite of his disappointment, he was still too much of a Frenchman and a soldier to allow his personal resentment to overcome his duty to his emperor, and he continued to hope that by his daring and success, he might still win his Polish crown. At Eylau, he showed his customary bravery and his magnificent talent as a cavalry leader when he saved the shattered corps of Augereau by a successful charge of over 12,000 sabres. At the Battle of Heilsberg, the celebrated light cavalryman, Lasalle, saved his life, but a few minutes later, the Grand Duke was able to cry quits by himself, rescuing Lasalle from the midst of a Russian charge. Unfortunately for Murat, the prospective alliance with Russia, once and for all, compelled Napoleon to lay aside all thought of reviving the Kingdom of Poland, and when the would-be king arrived with a Polish guard of honor and his fantastic uniform, he was met by the biting words of the emperor, "Go and put on your proper uniform. You look like a clown." After Tilsit, the disappointed Grand Duke returned to Paris, where his equally ambitious wife had been intriguing with Josephine, Talleyrand, and Fouché to get her husband nominated Napoleon's successor, in case the accidents of the campaign should remove the emperor. But Napoleon had no intention of dying without issue. Thanks to his brother-in-law's generosity, Murat was able to neglect his 500,000 subjects in Berg and spend his revenues right royally in Paris. But early in 1808, his ambition was once again inflamed by the hope of a crown, not a revived kingship in Poland, but the ancient scepter of Spain. Napoleon had decided that the Pyrenees should no longer exist, and that Portugal and Spain should become French provinces ruled by puppets of his own. Junot already held Portugal. It seemed as if it needed but a vigorous movement to oust the Bourbons from Madrid. Family quarrels had already caused a revolution in Spain. Charles had fled the kingdom, leaving the throne to his son Ferdinand. Both had appealed to Napoleon. Consequently, there was a decent pretext for sending a French army into Spain. On February 25th, Murat was dispatched at a few hours' notice with orders to take over the supreme command of all the French corps which were concentrating in Spain, to seize the fortresses of Pampeluna and Saint Sebastian, and to advance with all speed on Madrid, but he was given no clue as to what the emperor's ulterior object might be. He was ordered, however, to keep the emperor daily informed of the state of public opinion in Spain. Prince Joachim very soon perceived that King Charles was rejected by everybody, that the Prime Minister, the Prince of Peace, was extremely unpopular, and that Ferdinand was weak and irresolute. It seemed as if he would follow the example of the King of Portugal and would flee to the colonies when the French army approached his capital. The only disquieting feature of the situation was the constant annihilation of small parties of French soldiers and the brutal murder of all stragglers. On March 23rd, the French army entered Madrid. All was tranquil. Meanwhile, the ex-King Charles had retired to Bayonne, and by the orders of the emperor, the Prince of Peace was sent there also, whereupon King Ferdinand, fearing that Napoleon might take his father's part, hurried off to France. At Bayonne, both the claimants to the Spanish throne surrendered their rights to the emperor, while at Madrid, Murat, hoping against hope, played the royal part and kept the inhabitants quiet with bullfights and magnificent fêtes. So far, the Spaniards, though restless, were waiting to see whether the French were friends, as they protested, or in reality, stealthy foes. The crisis came on May 2nd, when the French troops were compelled to evacuate Madrid on account of the fury of the populace at the attempted abduction of the little prince, Don Francisco. Murat showed to the full his indomitable courage, fighting fiercely, not only for his emperor, but for the crown which he thought was his. Bitter indeed were his feelings when he received a letter dated that fatal day, May 2nd, informing him that Joseph was to be king of Spain, and that he might choose either Portugal or Naples as his kingdom. In floods of tears he accepted Naples, but so cruel was the blow that his health gave way, and instead of hurrying off to his new kingdom, he had to spend the summer drinking the waters at Barèges. His sensitive Gascon feelings had completely broken down under the disappointment, and, for the time being, he was physically and morally a wreck. Murat was in no hurry to commence his reign, and his subjects showed no great anxiety to see their new ruler. But when King Joachim Napoleon, to give him his new title, arrived at Naples, he was received with unexpected warmth. The new monarch, with his striking personality and good looks, at once captivated the hearts of his fickle southern subjects. Joseph had been prudent and cold. Joachim was ostentatious and fiery. The Neapolitans had never really cared for their Bourbon sovereigns. Some of the noblesse had from interest clung to the old dynasty, but the greater part of the nobility cared little who ruled them so long as their privileges were not interfered with. Among the middle class, there was a strong party which had accepted the doctrines of the French Revolution. The lower class were idle and lazy and willing to serve any sovereign who appealed to them by ostentation. The people who really held the key of the hearts of the mass of the population were the clergy. Joseph, with his liberal ideas, had attempted to free the people from clerical thraldom. Joachim, however, with his southern instincts, refused to deny himself the use of such a powerful lever, and quickly ingratiated himself with his new subjects. From the moment that he arrived at Naples, the new king determined, if not to rule Naples for the Neapolitans, at least, by pretending to do so, to rule Naples for himself and not for Napoleon. It is not therefore surprising that before the close of the year 1808 friction arose, which was further increased by the intrigues of Talleyrand and Fouché. These ministers, firmly convinced that Napoleon would never return from the Spanish War, had decided that in the event of his death, they would declare Murat his successor, rather than establish a regency for the young son of Louis Napoleon, the King of Holland. In pursuance of the plan of winning his subjects' affections, Joachim had at once called to his aid Agar, who had so successfully managed the finances of the Grand Duchy of Berg. The difficulties of finance in Naples were very great, and with Agar the king had to associate the subtle Corsican, Salicetti, who had so powerfully contributed to the rise of Napoleon. Taxation in Naples was heavy, for the Neapolitans had to find the money for the war with their old dynasty, which was threatening them from Sicily, aided by the English fleet. To secure the kingdom against the Sicilians and English, a large Neapolitan army of 30,000 troops had to be maintained along with an auxiliary force of 10,000 French. Moreover, the Neapolitans had to pay for having a king like Joachim and a queen consort like Caroline. The royal household alone required 1,395,000 ducats per annum. To meet this heavy expense, the ministers had to devise all sorts of expedients to raise money. Regular taxation, monopolies, mortgages, and loans barely sufficed to provide for the budget. Still, the king managed to retain his popularity and, in his own way, attempted to ameliorate the lot of his subjects. He introduced the Code Napoleon. He founded a military college, an artillery and engineer college, a naval college, a civil engineer college, and a polytechnic school. He also instituted primary schools in every commune and started an école normale for the training of teachers. He expanded the staff of the university and established an observatory and botanical garden at Naples. He attempted to conciliate the Neapolitan noblesse by gradually dismissing his French ministers and officers and appointing Neapolitan nobles in their place. At the same time, he abolished feudal dues and customs. He also attempted to develop industries by giving them protection. Above all, by the strict measures of his minister Manhess, he established peace in the interior by breaking down the organized system of the freebooters and robbers. As time went on, he found that the clergy and monks were too heavy a burden for his kingdom to bear, and at the expense of his popularity, he had to cut down the numbers of the dioceses and parishes and abolish the religious orders. From the first, the new king grasped the fact that his kingdom would always be heavily taxed, and his throne insecure as long as the Bourbons, backed by the English, held Sicily. His plan of campaign, therefore, was to drive his enemy out of the smaller islands, and thereafter to demand the aid of French troops and make a determined effort against Sicily. In October 1808, by a well-planned expedition, he captured the island of Capri and caused the English commander, Sir Hudson Lowe, to capitulate. It was not till the autumn of 1810, however, that he was ready for the great expedition. Relying on the traditional hatred of the people of Messina for the Bourbons, he collected a strong force on the straits and waited till the moment when, after a gale, the English fleet had not yet arrived from the roads of Messina. On the evening of September 17th, he sent away his advance guard of 2,000 men in 80 small boats. Cavaignac, the commander of this force, secured the important villages of Santo Stefano and Santo Paolo. But at the critical moment, the commander of the French division, acting according to the emperor's orders, refused to allow his troops to cross. Before fresh arrangements could be made, the English fleet reappeared on the scene, and Cavaignac and his force were thus sacrificed for no purpose. Joachim, as time showed, never forgave the emperor for the failure of his cherished plan. By the commencement of 1812, the coming Russian campaign overshadowed all other questions. Murat, who had earnestly begged to be allowed to share the Austrian campaign of 1809, was delighted to serve in person. But, as King of Naples, he refused to send a division of 10,000 men to reinforce the Grand Army. As a Frenchman and a soldier, he declared himself to the core a subject of the emperor. But as King of Naples, he aspired to perfect independence. It was this double attitude which, from the moment Murat became king, clouded the relations between him and Napoleon. But nevertheless, once he rejoined the emperor at Danzig, he laid aside all his royal aspirations and became the faithful, dashing leader of cavalry. During the advance on Moscow, the cavalry suffered terribly from the difficulties of constant reconnaissances and want of supplies. But in spite of this, Murat urged the emperor not to halt at Smolensk, but to push on, as he believed the Russians were becoming demoralized. Scarce a day passed without some engagement in which the King of Naples showed his audacity and his talent as a leader. Notwithstanding, Napoleon, angry at the constant escape of the Russians, declared that if Murat had only pursued Bagration in Lithuania, he would not have escaped. This reproach spurred on the King of Naples to even greater deeds of bravery, and so well was his figure known to the enemy that the Cossacks constantly greeted him with cries of "Hurrah! Hurrah, Murat!" At the Battle of Moscow, he and Ney completely overthrew the Russians, and if Napoleon had flung the Guard into the action, the Russian army would have been annihilated. In spite of the losses during the campaign, when the French evacuated Moscow, Murat had still 10,000 mounted troops, but by the time the army had reached the Beresina, there remained only 1,800 troopers with horses. When the emperor deserted the Grand Army, he left the King of Naples in command, with orders to rally the army at Vilna. But Murat saw that it was impossible to reform the army there, and accordingly ordered a retirement across the Niemen, a line which he soon found it was impossible to hold. On January 10, 1813, came the news that the Prussians had actually gone over to the enemy. It seemed as if Napoleon was lost, and Murat thereupon at once deserted the army and set out in all haste for Italy, thinking only of how to save his crown. The king arrived in Naples bent on maintaining his crown and on allowing no interference from the emperor. But in spite of this, he could not decide on any definite line of action. He was afraid the English and Russians would invade his country, but on the other hand, his old affection for Napoleon and a sort of sneaking belief in his ultimate success prevented him from listening to the insidious advice of the Austrian envoy whom the far-seeing Metternich had at once sent to Naples. If Napoleon had not in his dispatch glorified Prince Eugene's conduct to the disparagement of the King of Naples, if he had only vouchsafed some reply to the king's persistent letters of inquiry whether he still trusted his old comrade and lieutenant, Murat would have thrown himself heart and soul into the melee on the side of his old friend. But in April, Napoleon quitted Paris for the army in Germany without sending one line in reply to these imploring letters. Meanwhile, on April 23rd, came a letter from Colonel Coffin suggesting the possibility of effecting an entente between the English and Neapolitan governments, or at any rate, a commercial convention. Thereupon, Murat sent officers to enter into negotiations with Lord William Bentinck, who represented the English government in Sicily. All through the summer, the negotiations were continued, but Murat, in spite of the guarantee of the throne of Naples which the English offered, could not break entirely with his emperor and benefactor. Still, Napoleon, in his blindness, instead of attempting to conciliate his brother-in-law, allowed articles to his disparagement to appear in the Moniteur. Nevertheless, Murat at bottom was Napoleon's man. Elated by the emperor's success at Lutzen and Bautzen, although he refused to allow the Neapolitan troops to join the army of Italy under Prince Eugene, he hurried off in August to join the French army at Dresden. There, a reconciliation took place between the brothers-in-law. But after the defeat at Leipzig, King Joachim asked and obtained leave to return to his own dominions. His presence was needed at home, for in Italy also the war had gone against the French. Prince Eugene had had to fall back on the line of the Adda, and the defection of the Tyrol had opened to the Allies the passes into the peninsula. Murat, in his hurry, had to leave his coach snowed up in the Simplon Pass and proceed on horseback to Milan, where he halted but a few hours to write a dispatch to the emperor, which practically foretold his desertion. He declared that if he, instead of Eugene, was entrusted with the defense of Italy, he would at once march north from Naples with 40,000 men. He had indeed never forgotten the slight put upon him by the article in the Moniteur after the Russian campaign, and he was ready to sacrifice even his kingdom if only he could revenge himself on his enemy, Eugene. As Napoleon would not grant him this request, he determined to humiliate Eugene and, at the same time, to save his crown by negotiating with the enemy. On reaching Naples, he found that his wife, who hitherto had been an unbending partisan of the French, had entirely changed her politics and was now pledged to an Austrian alliance. The king was ever unstable. Vanity always governed his conduct. The queen was always determined, governed solely by a cold, calculating ambition. Negotiations were at once opened with the Austrians. The king protested that he desired nothing in the world so much as to make common cause with the Allied powers. He promised that he would join them with 30,000 troops on condition that he was guaranteed the throne of Naples and that he should have the Roman states in exchange for Sicily. Meanwhile, he addressed an order of the day to his army, stating that the Neapolitan troops should only be employed in Italy. This, of course, did not commit him either to Napoleon or the Austrian alliance. Meanwhile, the emperor had dispatched Fouché to try to bind his brother-in-law to France, but that distinguished double-dealer merely advised the Neapolitan king to move northwards to the valley of the Po with all his troops, and there to wait and see whether it would be best to help the French or to enter France with the Allies, and perhaps the Tuileries as emperor. Joachim Napoleon quietly occupied Rome and pushed forward his troops towards the Po, using the French magazines and depots, but still negotiating with the Austrians, and at the same time holding out hopes to the purely Italian party. For the National Party of the Risorgimento were striving hard to seize this opportunity to unite Italy and drive out the foreigner, and no one seemed more capable of carrying out their policy than the popular King of Naples. The Austrians flattered the hopes of young Italy by declaring in their proclamation that they had only entered Italy to free her from the yoke of the stranger, and to aid the King of Naples by creating an independent kingdom of Italy. Still, Murat hesitated on the brink. As late as the 27th of December, he wrote to the emperor proposing that Italy should be formed into 2 kingdoms, that he should govern all the peninsula south of the Po, and that the rest of the country should be left to Eugene. 3 days later, the Austrian envoy arrived with the proposals of the Allies. But he could not yet make up his mind, and moreover, the English had not yet guaranteed him Naples. In January, however, these guarantees were given, and against his will, he had to sign a treaty. Scarcely was the writing dry when he began to negotiate with Prince Eugene. He used every artifice to prevent a collision between the French and Neapolitan troops. When the campaign opened, his troops abandoned their position at the first shot, while he himself took good care not to reach the front until the news of Napoleon's abdication arrived. But Murat's conduct had alienated everybody. The French loathed him for his duplicity. The Allies suspected him of treachery, and the party of the Risorgimento looked on him as the cause of their subjection to the foreigner. For the Austrian victory had not brought Italy unity and independence, but had merely established the fetters of the old regime. During the remainder of 1814, the lot of the King of Naples was most unenviable. The restored Bourbons of France and Spain regarded him as the despoiler of the Bourbon House of Sicily. Russia had been no party to the guarantee of his kingdom. England desired nothing so much as his expulsion. Austria alone upheld him, for she had been the chief party to the treaty, but Metternich was waiting for him to make some slip which might serve as a pretext for tearing up that treaty. Even the Pope refused the bribe which the king offered him when he proposed to restore the marches in return for receiving the papal investiture. In despair, Murat once again entered into negotiations with the Italian party. A general rising was planned in Lombardy, but failed, as the Austrians received news of the proposed cession of Milan. With cruel cunning, they spread the report that the King of Naples had sold the secret. Henceforward, Murat had no further hope. Foreigners, Italians, priests, Carbonari, and Freemasons, all had turned against him. Such was the situation when on March 8, 1815, the king heard that Napoleon had left Elba. As usual, he dealt double. He at once sent a message to England that he would be faithful, while at the same time he sent agents to Sicily to try to stir up a revolt against the Bourbons. As soon as the news of Napoleon's reception in France arrived, he set out at the head of 40,000 troops, thinking that all Italy would rise for him. But the Italians mistrusted the fickle king. The Austrian troops were already mobilized, and accordingly, early in May, the Neapolitan army fled homewards before its enemies. King Joachim's popularity was gone. A grant of a constitution roused no enthusiasm among the people. City after city opened its gates to the enemy. Resistance was hopeless, so on the night of May 19th, the King of Naples, with a few 100,000 francs in his diamonds, accompanied by a handful of personal friends, fled by sea to Cannes. But the emperor refused to receive the turncoat, though at St. Helena he bitterly repented this action, lamenting that at Waterloo Murat might have given us the victory. For what did we need? To break 3 or 4 English squares. Murat was just the man for the job. After Waterloo, the poor king fled before the White Terror, and for some time lay hid in Corsica. There he was given a safe conduct by the Allies and permission to settle in Austria. But the deposed monarch could not overcome his vanity. He still believed himself indispensable to Naples. Some 400 Corsicans promised to follow him thither. The filibustering expedition set out in 3 small ships on the 28th of September. A storm arose and scattered the armada, but in spite of this, on October 7th, the ex-king decided to land at Pizzo. Dressed in full uniform, amid cries of "Long live our King Joachim," the unfortunate man landed with 26 followers. He was at once arrested, and on October 13th, tried by court-martial, condemned to death, and executed a few hours later. Joachim Murat met his death like a soldier. As he wrote to his wife, his only regret was that he died far off, without seeing his children. Death was what he courted when landing at Pizzo, for he must have known how impossible it was for him to conquer a kingdom with 26 men. Still, he preferred to die in the attempt to regain his crown rather than to spend an ignoble old age, a pensioner on the bounty of his enemies. Murat died as he had lived, brave but vain, with his last words calling out, "Soldiers, do your duty. Fire at my heart, but spare my face." The King of Naples owed his elevation entirely to his fortunate marriage with the emperor's sister. Otherwise, it is certain he would never have reached such exalted rank, for Napoleon really did not like him or trust him, and had a true knowledge of his ability. He was a paladin, said the emperor at St. Helena, in the field, but in the cabinet destitute of either decision or judgment. He loved, I may rather say, adored me. He was my right arm, but without me, he was nothing. In battle, he was perhaps the bravest man in the world, Left to himself, he was an imbecile without judgment. Murat was a cavalry leader, pure and simple. His love of horses, his intuitive knowledge of exactly how much he could ask from his horsemen, his reckless bravery, his fine swordsmanship, his dashing manners captivated the French cavalry and enabled him to achieve the impossible. Contrary to accepted opinion, Napoleon believed that cavalry, if led by equally brave and resolute men, must always break infantry. Consequently, we find that at Austerlitz, Jena, and Eylau, the decisive stroke of the day was in each case given by immense bodies of some 20,000 men under the command of Murat, whose genius lay in his ability to maneuver these huge bodies of cavalry on the field of battle, and in the tenacity with which he clung to and pursued a beaten enemy. But this was the sum total of his military ability. He had no conception of the use of the other arms of the service, and never gained even the most elementary knowledge of strategy. When trusted with anything like the command of a mixed body of troops, he proved an utter failure. Before Ulm, he nearly ruined Napoleon's combination by failing to get in contact with the enemy. In the later half of the campaign of 1806, he hopelessly failed to make any headway against the Russians east of the Vistula. In the retreat across the Niemen, he proved himself absolutely incapable of reorganizing a beaten force. As a king, Murat was full of good intentions towards his people, but his extravagance, his vanity, his indecision cost him his crown. As a man, he was generous and extraordinarily brave. In the Russian campaign, he used to challenge the Cossacks to single combat, and when he had beaten them, he sent them away with some medal or souvenir of himself. He was a good husband and lived at peace and amity with his wife, and was exceedingly fond of his children. His faults were numerous. He was by nature intensely jealous, especially of those who came between him and Napoleon, and he stooped to anything whereby he might injure his rivals, Lannes and Prince Eugene. His hot southern blood led him into numerous quarrels. Although extremely arrogant, at bottom he was a moral coward, and before the emperor's reproaches he scarcely dared to open his mouth. But his great fault, through which he gained and lost his crown, was his vanity. Vanity, working on ambition and an unstable character, is the key to all his career. His blatant Jacobinism, his intrigue with Josephine, his overtures to the directors, his underhand treatment of his fellow marshals, his discontent with his Grand Duchy, his subtle dealings in Spain, his system of government in Naples, his opposition to Napoleon's schemes, his dissimulation and desertion, his almost theatrical bravery, and his very death were due to nothing save extravagant vanity.
This concludes Chapter 2 of Napoleon's Marshals by R.P. Dunn-Pattison. Join us also for Chapter 3 about ANDRÉ MASSÉNA. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. We'll get back to you next week. Thank you very much, and so long.